All right. In this last part of this video series on measurement, we're going to talk a little bit about validity and give some examples of what some problems of validity are that have arisen in the political science literature, particularly focusing on two studies that were discussed in the book. Measuring one was using what's called a polity four score to measure democracy, and the other is a study on political tolerance. But before I do that, let's just kind of review what validity means again. So a valid measure is a measure that accurately, in some sense or other, measures the concept that it sets out to measure. And there are three types of validity. There's what we call face validity, there's content validity, and construct validity. So face validity is the most basic type of validity where this is all kind of conceptual, it's not really formal. And the question that you want to ask there is, does the measure subjectively capture the concept that it's supposed to, right? So can you look at the measure and say, oh, okay, that accurately measures the concept that it's supposed to measure? Content validity is whether the concept measures all aspects, or the measure measures all aspects of the concept that you'd like to measure. Okay, does it only measure one type or like one portion of the concept, or does it measure others? And we'll see in the measuring democracy study that the polity measure has an issue with content validity, in that it only tends to measure a small part of democracy, right? And it really completely ignores a larger part, which is problematic in many ways, which we'll discuss. And construct validity, finally, is the degree to which the measure captures what it claims to measure. And that's kind of similar to content validity, except that construct validity is a little bit more formal. And when you ask whether something has construct validity, you're really asking, well, okay, we set out to measure something at this level, okay, and so we set out to measure all of the aspects of democracy. What percentage of the aspects of democracy does our measure actually capture? And so that's what kind of construct validity looks at. All right, so let's give some examples of studies in which there is a problem with validity. So a big question in political science literature is, especially in comparative politics, for those of you who studied comparative politics, is whether a country is more democratic or not. Okay, that's one thing that people are interested in measuring. And another thing is, once we've defined that, whether one country is more democratic than the other, what does it actually mean for a country to become more or less democratic? And these things are ultimately tied in together. So in order to measure something like, a country being more or less democratic, or to figure out whether a country is becoming more or less democratic over time, you have to first figure out what democracy is. So you have to really make a statement about what democracy is, and then go out into the world and use, surveys, measurement tools, and so on to measure what democracy is. So there's the philosopher Robert Dahl, who did some very interesting studies in the past in New Haven. You should really read some of his work. He attributes two things to democracy, right? He says for any kind of country or any governmental unit to be democratic, it has to have these two features. There has to be contestation, so there has to be elections held, right? There has to be, political leaders vying for power and so on. And there also has to be participation. So, an ancient Greek democracy where there were elections and everyone voted, or certain groups of people voted, right? Those types of societies would have lots of contestation, but they would have less participation, because in ancient Greece only the wealthy landowners tended to vote. They were all old men, tended to vote, and so on. So democracy, according to Dahl, has both contestation and participation. And if you're missing one of those completely, you could have a society where there are elections and only the top 0.01% of income earners get to vote, but they're fair elections and they're contests between the people who are vying for power, well, that would not be a very democratic state because it's missing participation. Okay, and you could also have another another side of the coin where you have let's say a king or something, and you could easily imagine this happening. There's a kingdom, there's a monarchy, right, where there's no contestation at all, but there's plenty of participation. So perhaps the king asks people what kind of policies they want, or whether they approve or disapprove of the policies, and he actually, or acts on whether they do that, like the decisions people make, right? So the king might, propose a referendum, let's say, and base his policy decisions upon how people vote on that referendum. That would be a high participation society, but it would have no contestation, right? So that would be a society that would have less democracy. It would be a monarchy, basically. Okay, so with the polity 4 measure and with the polity measures in general, the other subsequent ones that came out after 2004, what they were trying to capture was how democratic a nation is and how can we track it over time. And to do that, they set out to measure these 4 things. Okay, regulation of executive recruitment. So how are people in the executive branch recruited? Like, how are they brought to the point at which you see them on a ballot? Okay. 2, competitiveness of executive recruitment. How competitive is the process the process through which the executive comes to power, right? So in the United States, we would think about primaries and these kinds of things, right? And then 3, the openness of executive recruitment. So how open is executive recruitment? So how transparent is the process? And then finally 4, constraints on the chief executive. How many constraints does the chief executive have? And this polity score measures democracy and autocracy as a function of each of these four things. All right. And to do this, they basically get a group of experts and they ask them to score countries in the following way. So, for example, let's take the first criteria, regulation of executive recruitment. So, a country would have a +3 score if there was regular competition between recognized groups, a +2 if there was transitional competition, and a +1 if there was factional or restricted patterns of competition. So, or 0 if there was no competition. So, like for regulation of executive recruitment, so that would be the first one. A really good, regular competition between recognized groups, that would be the highest you can go, and no competition between the groups is the lowest, right? So, you could imagine the different countries in which these would apply. Okay. So then, there are these series of questions for each of these elements, and the group of experts score them. Okay. And one interesting thing about this is that you can see that these elements do a really good job of capturing one part of Dahl's discussion of democracy, the contestation part, right? So they really dive deep into an understanding of whether elections are present, whether they're fair, at each stage of the process, whether there is something put in place that ensures fair contestation. But what's missing is the participation part, okay? And so, in a way, this is really an incomplete measure of democracy. So what do I mean by that? Okay, so like all of these elements talk about competitiveness, right? But they don't actually talk about things like, as we mentioned in ancient Greece, right? We said that in ancient Greece, ancient Greece was a society which had high contestation. They had very democratic elections, but they had low participation because only a certain group of individuals participated in elections. A very small group of very powerful individuals participated in elections. And you can see from each of these elements of polity, there's really no accounting for participation at all. It's all about competitiveness and not about participation. And so this would be a measure which tends to have problems with what we called content validity. So let's go back to our slide here. Content validity is the question we want to ask as to whether a study has content validity is, does a measure capture all aspects of the concept? Okay? And clearly, in this case, the polity score does not measure all aspects of the concept. And so what are the consequences of this? Well, they're pretty serious, right? And let's take a look at what the polity metric of the United States from its inception until 2004. Now, there were a lot of things that went on in the United States between 1800 and 2004, one of which is women's suffrage, another of which is the civil rights movement, another of which is slavery ending after the Civil War. Are any of these things captured here? Kind of, like, the Civil War aspect is captured slightly in this part here, right, where you actually see a dip to some extent during the Civil War, and it goes back up again. But participation here is not measured at all. We see no increase in so-called democracy in the United States as a result of women's suffrage, right? We see no, African Americans are able to vote, other ethnic groups are able to vote after a certain point in time, the repeal of Jim Crow laws. There's all this stuff going on. And what do we see? Right? There's one big flat line there, right? So we're missing a big part of what democracy means, and that big part is participation. So this is an example of a measure in which content validity tends to be a problem. All right. Let's talk about another issue, another study which is interesting, and this is a study done on political tolerance and intolerance. So let's think about this for a second, right? What is political tolerance, or what is political intolerance, and how would you go about measuring it? This is not an easy question, and it's something that you should going to have you think about in the homework this week. So, at a very basic level, we could probably think of tolerance in the following way. A tolerant individual, or someone who is tolerant, is, and this is a little bit more of a formal definition, but I think it works very well. A tolerant individual is someone who is willing to give rights, whether they be procedural or otherwise, to people that they disagree with. Okay? So if I disagree, if I'm a right winger and I disagree with your extreme left wing viewpoints, but I'm still willing to let you say them, I'm still willing to allow you to speak freely, right? If I was a ruler, let's say, I would be someone who's tolerant. Similarly, if I was a left wing leader and you were a right wing individual, and I wasn't suppressing, and I allowed you to speak freely, to openly speak, to not censor you in any way, that would also make me tolerant, right? So tolerance really is giving rights to people that you disagree with at a very basic level. Now, there was an interesting study that was done in the 50s. It was based on a book. It was written by this fellow here, Samuel Stilfer, on communism, conformity, and civil liberties. A cross-section of the nation speaks his mind. And what Stilfer had done in this study was to try to figure out a way of measuring political tolerance on a scale. Now, we kind of look back at these things today and we say, oh, this is kind of silly, or this is not that great, it has problems, and it does. But you have to remember, this was very groundbreaking work at the time, and other people had not, or few people had actually done this in a formal way. So just kind of keep things in context. Remember, this book was published in 1955, so that's just something to keep in mind. So Stouffer, in his book Communism, Conformity, and Civil Liberties, published in 1955, he measured political tolerance in the following way. Because remember, this is the height of the Civil War. Communism and atheism were obviously very taboo kinds of subjects, and being a communist was one of the worst things you could be at this time, labeled as a communist, right? And so Stouffer set out to understand how tolerant people were in the society that he was studying by asking questions such as, should a communist or atheist be allowed to speak, teach, or have a book in the library? Okay, so the presumption, of course, is that everyone is against communism, and if you say that you are for communism, or you're not that you're for communism, if you say that you're allowing a communist to speak, to teach, or have a book in a library, that makes you tolerant because the presumption is that you're against communism. Because the whole society, is against communism. It's not necessarily true, but that was the assumption. Okay, so that was this measure of tolerance. Now you can see what one of the fundamental problems with this are, right? In terms of validity. So if we're thinking about this in terms of whether this is a valid measure of tolerance, we have to consider whether it actually measures the extent to which someone who you disagree with is being granted procedural rights. So the assumption here is that people are against communism and people are against atheism. But if the society changes such that everyone becomes a communist and everyone becomes an atheist, and you ask the same question, right? This question really wouldn't measure tolerance at all, right? Does that make sense? It wouldn't measure tolerance at all, okay? So that would be a problem of faith validity to a large extent, okay? So, this would be a problem with faith validity to the extent that it's not even necessarily measuring what it is that we hope for it to measure, which is tolerance, right? Because there's an assumption embedded in it. And people who did follow-up studies on this, including these folks here, and this is an article published in the 1979 issue of the American Political Science Review, and it was by Sullivan et al., Sullivan, Pearson, and Marcus. It's entitled "An Alternative Conceptualization of Political Tolerance, Illusory Increases Between 1950s and 1970s." So this is what these people found out, okay? So using Stouffer's definition of tolerance, people have kind of studied it, and they said, oh, okay, look, they found that tolerance seems to be increasing over time because people are becoming more and more tolerant of communists and atheists. But that tolerance increase is illusory because it wasn't that people were becoming more tolerant of communists and atheists. There were more people becoming communists and atheists. You see what I mean? And you see the difference? So if the society itself is becoming more left-wing, and there are more communists in your sample, more atheists in your sample, and you ask them the same question, should a communist or atheist be allowed to speak, right? If they're already a communist or atheist, that doesn't necessarily indicate that they're tolerant, because now the society has shifted such that the viewpoint itself is no longer taboo. The whole assumption upon which the tolerance metric here is based, the assumption that people oppose communism, oppose atheism, and are granting rights to these people because they oppose them, right? That is swept away if people become more communists and more atheists. And that's exactly what this study had pointed out, right? That's why they say it's illusory increases in tolerance between the 50s and 70s, and it's illusory because the measure itself is not getting at the idea of political tolerance, okay? Because it's just that people tend to be more likely to agree with communism and atheism, okay? And so that's really that's really the issue that we have here, and what these authors propose is that there's a new measure necessary to understand tolerance, right? So, and you could think about what those measures might look like, and you're welcome, of course, to read the article if you'd like, which I'm going to post in the video here, and also on our ELC. What you really need to do, if you really want to measure tolerance in a kind of more absolute way, is you first need to get a sense of what people's opinions are on the issues. Okay? And then you need to refine the question which suggests tolerance for the opposite of their viewpoint. So let me give you an example. If everyone in your society is communist, asking a question about giving rights to communists does not indicate tolerance. But if everyone in your society is communist and you ask questions about giving rights to capitalists, let's say, or something like that, and then people answer those questions, as yes or no, right? That will give you a good example that will give you a good idea of how tolerant people are. Similarly, if everyone in the society is capitalist or everyone in the society opposes communism, and you ask them how sympathetic they are to capitalism, you're not figuring out whether they're tolerant, right? What you need to do is, for communists, you need to ask them how sympathetic they are to capitalism. For capitalists, you need to figure out how sympathetic they are to communism. And then construct some metric so that controlling for the viewpoints these people already hold, right, and giving them their opposing viewpoints, that's how you measure tolerance, right? That's really the only way to do it. Because tolerance always has to be, how willing are you to give, again, let's go back to the definition. How willing are you to give procedural rights to people you disagree with? So you have to find what the issues that people hold and then figure out what they disagree with to get a sense of how tolerant they are. You need to, if someone is pro-abortion, you need to figure out how tolerant they are towards, let's say, giving the right to speak towards people who are anti-abortion. If people are anti-abortion, you need to figure out how willing they are to give people the right to speak who are pro-abortion, and so on. Okay, so that's kind of what, I'm not going to go into some of the details about this, but that's what the Sullivan study talks about. All right, so I'm going to wrap this up now, and let's just do a quick review, and we'll talk about some of the consequences of poor measurement. So, we talked about the problem of measurement and what the issue was behind that, and we said that we want to measure some kind of causal connection between two variables. And in order to do that, we have to go from some abstract concepts to actually measuring these concepts. And then we talked about three issues of measurement: conceptual clarity, reliability, and validity. We said that conceptual clarity, the idea behind that is the concept that we're measuring clear. Reliability is the measurement that we're creating. Can it be consistently applied? Is it consistent, right, over the same units over time? And validity is basically whether the measure is in itself valid, right? Is the measure valid? And then there are three types of validity we talked about: face validity, content validity, and construct validity. And each of these gets at validity in a different way. Face validity is a broader measure, and it discusses whether a measure subjectively captures the concept that's supposed to. Content validity is the question that you would ask is whether the measurement, it measures all aspects of the concept, and then construct validity is the degree to which the measure captures what it claims to measure. And the two examples we gave were the polity measure, which measures democracy. And we said that this polity measure has problems because it lacks content validity. It doesn't capture all the aspects of the concept. It's missing the concept of participation here, right? Although it measures contestation very well. And then we talked about the Stouffer study on communism, and we said, well, okay, if we define tolerance as giving procedural rights to people you disagree with, Well, asking people only about whether they're tolerant towards atheists or communists is just simply not going to work. Because if people become atheists or communists, there's no absolute, we're not going to be measuring whether they're willing to give rights to people who they oppose because they don't oppose it anymore. So that's not really a good measure of tolerance. And the correction to that was trying to figure out, well, what positions do people hold in the first place? Right? That was Sullivan's example here. And then controlling for the people that the positions that people hold in the first place, figuring out what they would oppose, and then asking them how tolerant they are or how willing they are to give rights to those who they oppose. Right? Again, it's always about what you hold, what principles you hold, and how willing you are to give rights to those you oppose. Right? If you're willing to give rights to people who match your exact ideological proclivities, it doesn't matter. Right? That's not how tolerance would be measured. And so, what are the consequences of poor measurement? Right? So we're kind of like at the final part here of this outline. Well, the consequences of poor measurement can be really, really bad. Okay, I mean everything we do in social science, in polling, or whatever it might be, it depends upon making good measures, on creating measures that link the causal variable with the causal variables with something that occurs in reality. And just to give you an example of one of the consequences of poor measurement, right? Because let's say the polity measure here doesn't take into account participation, we would get a sense that the United States, over the period from 1800 to 2004, the amount of democracy, let's say, the change in democracy in the U.S. hadn't really shifted that much at all. Well, we know that's clearly not true from the historical record, right? And then of course the other, the Sullivan example is, the Stouffer example, and the Sullivan example that they point out is, we thought that we could believe we might falsely believe now that tolerance in the society is increasing because people are more sympathetic to communists and atheists, but that's not necessarily true. That's just the society shifting towards more communism, more atheism, but not necessarily more tolerance, right? It's just that the society itself is changing. So we get completely warped versions or warped ideas about how society is changing. And that's really the issues of measurement. Great. So that's it. I hope to answer any questions you might have on Tuesday, Thursday in our office hours, and hope to see you there. Don't forget to check out the video that I'm going to post on the R Lab as well. Bye bye.